What did he say? Did I hear him say, blessed are the cheesemakers? Many of you may have remembered that from an old Monty Python movie where Jesus was giving his Sermon on the Mount and the people couldn't understand what he was saying because they were so far away. Welcome to What is a Lutheran with Pastor Fred here in St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. Today we are on part 3 of Who is Jesus? In part 1 and part 2 we talked about his birth and then his circumcision and going to the temple and escape to Egypt and all that stuff. Part 2 we talked about his baptism and his temptation in the wilderness by Satan and then his calling of his 12 disciples. Now the tendency in most presentations about Jesus is then to skip right to his death and resurrection, as if nothing happened in between that time. Well, if you read like the Gospel of Matthew, 20 chapters happens in between that time. So I want to spend some time today talking about the things that happened in between that calling of disciples and his arrest. One of the first things that happens is that Sermon on the Mount we just talked about, and the Beatitudes were part of that, where Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And Jesus is basically saying those people that desire the things of God, the spiritual things of God, will be blessed, will be given them. And then he continues into other parts of that sermon, talking, for instance, about how we are salt and we are light. And what is salt? Well, salt is what gives flavor to life and also is a preservative. And Christians are to be that salt that brings in the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the love of God, and preserves people for eternity. And light, well, in a sinful world full of darkness, Jesus Christ is the light of the world. And we are also to witness that light and bring that light through our testimony about who Jesus is for us and for others. In the midst of that sermon, Jesus also said that he came to fulfill the law. And that takes us back to the Old Testament, where the Old Testament sacrificial system about sacrificing lambs, observing the Sabbath day, which of course that day was Saturday, laws of circumcision, the laws of the Passover and stuff like that. And he said, I have come to fulfill that. And he is the fulfillment of that, because his blood is what is the final blood. All the blood of the animals and the bulls and all the sacrifices were to point forward to Christ and his dying on the cross and his shedding of his blood. And that law is fulfilled in him. He is the final sacrifice. He also talked about things like anger. He said, anger really amounts to murder. And that he says, do not sin in your anger. That we are to forgive and have compassion for people. He also talked about lust and adultery and saying that those sins were not just sins that were committed physically, but were committed in our minds and our hearts when we look lustfully at somebody else, or even hate and anger when we look angrily at somebody else. And so basically he said, we're sinning all the time, and that we should have compassion toward others. One of the most countercultural things he says in the Sermon on the Mount is love your enemies. Now in that day and age, of course, love your enemy was crazy. Well, in our day and age, love your enemy? That doesn't sound like any sense at all, because how can you love your enemy? They're your enemy. That's why you wouldn't love them. But Jesus tells us to love our enemies. He even tells us later to pray for our enemies. And why is that? Well, if we look at our relationship with God, first of all, we were his enemy. In our sin, we were opposed to God. And God loved us anyway. And he forgave us. He made us his friends. And we did nothing to reconcile that relationship. It was all Christ doing it for us. So he says, love your enemies, pray for your enemies. Countercultural thinking, but we're to have the mind of Christ. After the Sermon on the Mount, at a later point, his disciples come to him and say, Lord, teach us to pray. Now, the Jews prayed. It wasn't like, well, we've never heard of this prayer thing. What is it? No, they said, but they knew Jesus was different. So they said, well, how are we supposed to pray? And Jesus gives them the Lord's Prayer, which we'll talk about in later episodes. And another thing, after Jesus does all this teaching, talk about who he is and how to be his follower, Jesus also performs miracles. And miracles are basically things that don't naturally happen. In other words, you have cancer and you're healed of cancer without any medical treatment or anything like that. Or, you die and somebody raises you from the dead by just commanding you to raise, or somebody disappears when they're by their own command. So it's something you don't naturally expect to happen. And Jesus did those. One of the miracles he did is he was out on a boat with his disciples one day, and he was asleep, and a storm came up, and the waves were rocking the boat. They were afraid they're going to die, and they woke Jesus up, and he commanded the winds and the wave to calm down, and they did. Another one, he walked on water. People don't walk on water. Well, Jesus did. He heals people that are sick, like a paralytic. He heals him, and the man gets up and walks away. He heals lepers. He throws out demons of people. He raises Lazarus from the dead. On two different occasions. One occasion he fed 4,000 people with bread and some fish. Another time it was 5,000 people. Just things that don't normally happen. In doing that, Jesus proved that he was God, that he was the Savior. And Jesus never did these miracles for the sake of themselves. In other words, he wasn't putting on a show. It wasn't like, hey, let's go see Jesus because he's like got this Vegas act going on. No, Jesus always performed a miracle to show people who he was. It was to prove to them, hey, I'm the guy. And of course, you have to show compassion for people. So his words combined with his miracles were to point people to him, so they could have salvation in him. Well, after doing this for quite a long time, the Pharisees have been watching us. The Pharisees, Sadducees were the Jewish religious leaders. They come to him and they're saying, well, if you really are the Christ, give us a sign. He's just like, dude, I just healed these people. I just threw out these demons. Don't you get it? Don't you get I'm fulfilling Old Testament prophecy? So he kind of looks at them and sarcastically says, although truthfully says, I'll tell you what, buddy, I'll give you a sign. I'll give you the sign of Jonah. Now, remember Jonah? Jonah's the Old Testament character who got swallowed by a fish and then burped up after 3 days. What Jesus is telling them is, you're going to kill me, and I'm going to be in the tomb, and on the third day, I'm going to get burped up. In other words, I'm going to rise from the dead. Now, of course, they're like, they don't get it, and hopefully some of them got it after his resurrection, because the resurrection is the concrete proof that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's central to our faith. Another thing that Jesus did is he told parables. And these are stories with hidden meanings, or meanings that are beyond the story. In other words, you tell a story, but there's not a moral to it so much, but a revealing of the kingdom. And one of the parables he told was the parable of the weeds. And what he said here was there was a farmer that went out and he sowed his wheat. And then the next day, or several days later, his workers go out and they find the wheat sprouting up, but they also find weeds. And they come back and tell him, and he says, yeah, an enemy did this. And they said, well, should we go out and pull the weeds out? And he goes, no, if you pull the weeds out, you're going to pull out the wheat as well. Let them grow together, and at the end, separate them and throw the weeds into the fire and put the wheat in my barn. Now, the parable, what he's trying to teach them is that in this sinful world that we live in, as believers, there are also evil people in the midst of it as well, and that Jesus is going to take them out now because of the harm it could cause to us, but at the end, they will be separated and thrown into the fire, and that believers will be taken into heaven. And he tells these parables like the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sheep. There's all kinds, the parable of the prodigal son, all kinds of parables. Very interesting reading, but they all are stories with a kingdom point that point to the gospel. Now, toward the end of his ministry, Jesus one day asked his disciples, who do the people say that I am? And his disciples came back and said, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're from prophet, And then he asks a question that all of us have to answer, even you watching this video. And that is, who do you say that I am? Who do you say that Jesus is? Well, Peter responds, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus commends him for that answer. That was revealed to you by God, my Father. He says, and upon this faith, your faith, I will build my church. In other words, upon the fact that Peter believes that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that is what the church is built upon, justification by faith alone in Jesus Christ. And that's a question we all have to answer. The last thing we're going to cover today is that Jesus, right before he starts heading toward Jerusalem, goes up on a mountain and transfigures before the disciples. In other words, his clothes glow and he glows. And down come Moses and Elijah from the Old Testament, who are both, of course, dead, but they come back and they're appearing and glowing in that, and they're talking with Jesus. It says at one point they're talking about his basically his departure after his death and resurrection. And the disciples see this, and then it all stops, and all they see is Jesus, and Jesus comes down the mountain, and he tells them, I don't tell anybody until after I've risen from the dead. And they don't get it at that point, but later on in 1 Peter they talk about, yeah, we saw this, that this proved that this Jesus really was. He appeared with Moses and Elijah, he glowed, he was the heavenly experience. And then at that Mount of Transfiguration, he walks down and he starts heading toward Jerusalem, heading toward his death. And we're going to pick that up next week in part 4. But again, thank you for joining us for What is a Lutheran with Pastor Fred at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. And God bless, and we'll see you next week. Blessings.